I love this painting. My wife gave me this actual painting years ago, and you can see it's a biblical scene. Jesus is calming the storm on Galilee, and I love the detail in the faces of some of the apostles. There, you can see how terrified they are. There was a time when the great artists, the famous artists, would paint primarily as the subject biblical stories. One of Michelangelo's most famous paintings is the painting of the Last Judgment. I've seen it myself. It's at the Sistine Chapel in Rome, and the Christ is coming. There's angels, demons. It's so vivid. You know how old he was when he painted that? 67 years old. When he finished it, he was 67. Most people are retired at that point, and he's doing some of his greatest work. It reminds me of our passage today. We're in Deuteronomy chapter 31, and we see how old Moses is. He's elderly. In fact, he's 120 years old, and we're about to enter into the promised land. Moses has the people of Israel gathered, and he gives them this motivational speech. He gives them this charge. He says, I'm not going to be able to go with you into the promised land, but here's what you need to know. And so we're going to read beginning in verse 1. So Moses went and spoke these words to all Israel. And he said to them, I am 120 years old today. Today. Well, happy birthday, Moses. I'm 120 today. I'm no longer able to come and go. And the Lord has said to me, you shall not cross this Jordan. But it is the Lord your God who will cross ahead of you. He will destroy these nations before you, and you will dispossess them. Joshua is the one who will cross ahead of you, just as the Lord has spoken. So Moses tells them, he says, I'm 120 years old. He says, I can't come and go the way I used to. So he has some limitations. But he tells them, Joshua will go with you. And even though I can't cross the Jordan, don't miss what he said in verse 2. In verse 3, he said, it is the Lord your God who will cross ahead of you. What we see here is a transition of leadership from Moses to Joshua. But they needed to be reminded, it's not me and it's not Joshua. It's not Mo or Josh. It's God. God is the one who goes before you. I'm the pastor at Willowbrook, but there was a pastor before me and there will be a pastor after me. I may get the privilege of teaching God's people, God's word, but God is the shepherd of his church. It's his church. It's not mine. And so we see a transition in leadership, but also a reminder that God is your leader. And I jotted down a couple of things that stood out to me. The first was this: you are never too old to be used by God. Moses is 120. And he says, I have some limitations. We get older and we get limitations. I heard about this woman in the church, and she walked up to a lady. She hadn't seen her in such a long time. And she said, it's been so long since I've seen you, and I'm embarrassed, but I forgot your name. What? Would you remind me, what is your name? And the woman paused. She said, do you need an answer right away? Someone said, just as soon as our pimples go away, as soon as our face clears up, we lose our mind. I've reached an age, I forget things. I'm glad I have my phone so I can look it up. Well, you might feel like your best years are behind you. Did you know Moses' most productive years began when he was 80? First 40 years, he's in Egypt. He's living in the palace. The next 40 years, he's watching sheep in the wilderness. He's a shepherd. And then there's a burning bush. And at the age of 80, God calls him to set the people free from Egyptian slavery. And from 80 to 120, the last 40 years of his life were his most productive. It has been said the first 40 years, he thought he was a somebody. in the Egyptian palace. The next 40 years of his life, he thought he was a nobody, chasing livestock around. And then the last 40 years of his life, he learned that God can take a nobody and turn him into a somebody when they surrender to him. I don't care how old you are. You're not too old to be used by God. Whether it's Michelangelo painting a masterpiece or John Wesley, the great preacher of old. He preached until he died. He preached all the way up to age 87. When he got kicked out of the Anglican church, when they persecuted him, they wouldn't let him preach in the church. He went to his father's grave, and they said, they can't kick me off my own father's grave. And he used his headstone as a pulpit, and he preached on his dad's grave. And he didn't quit preaching. Well into his 80s, he preached until God called him to heaven. I don't know how old you are, but don't ever think that you're too old to be used by God. Your best days may be now. Well, let's keep on reading. Moses, he's challenging the people, and he says to them, the Lord will do to them, talking about the nations in the promised land. They're going to have to defeat some nations. God promised it to you, but you've got to win some battles. The Lord will do to them just as he did to Sihon and Og, the kings of the Amorites, and to their land when he destroyed them. That's verse 4. Second thing I jotted down was this. Remember past victories. Moses says, hey, look, this wasn't that long ago when we defeated the kings of the Amorites. Remember what God did to them? He will do it again. Some of you are going through a difficult time right now. It might be a relationship. It might be a health challenge. It might be something with the child or your finances. I don't know what you're facing. But I know that God's been good to you before. You've won victories before. God's brought you through in the past. And it's helpful sometimes to remember the same God who delivered me then is the same God who's going to deliver me today and tomorrow, no matter how threatening tomorrow may be. God is the same. So he reminds them of past victories to give them courage for future success. And we continue to read in verse 6. He tells the people, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or tremble at them. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you. He will not fail you or forsake you. Then, verse 7, Moses calls Joshua. So Moses told everybody, be strong and courageous. It is God who goes before you. But then he calls Joshua out. And now he says to Joshua, while everyone else is listening, you, Joshua, be strong and courageous, for you shall go with the people into the land the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give to them as an inheritance. God goes ahead of you. God is with you. He will not forsake you. Do not fear. Do not be dismayed. And the last thing I jotted down was this. Be strong and courageous because God is on your side. Remember Joshua? He was one of the 12 spies way back in Numbers chapter 13. That when they were going to enter the promised land the first time, they sent 12 spies into the land. Go check it out. And let me read to you some names. They're names out of the Bible. I'm sure that you're familiar with these names. Shemua, Shaphat, Igal, Hoshea, Palti, Gadiel, Gadi, Emuel, Sether, and Nahbi. You knew those names, right? You didn't know any of those names, did you? But they're in the Bible. Those were the 10 spies who said no. 12 spies went. Joshua came back. Caleb came back and said, we should by all means go into this land. It flows with milk and honey. It's amazing. Look, we brought some grapes. Taste the grapes. They had faith. God promised it to us. It belongs to us. And these other 10 names that you've never heard of, those were the 10 spies that said, no, we can't do it. The cities are fortified. They have the Anakim lived there. The Nephilim lived there. Giants are living in the land. Those were the giants. We could never take it. And the people listened to the 10. And they ended up wandering in the wilderness for the next 40 years. And nobody remembers those names because those are the people who lacked faith. But we know Joshua, now all these years later, he will lead them into the promised land. People name their children Caleb, don't they? Because Caleb had faith. He was strong and he was courageous. In fact, I love this. Last time we see Caleb in the Bible was in Joshua chapter 14, verse 12. And Caleb said this, I'm 85 years old, but I'm as strong today as I was 45 years ago. Remember, you're never too old to be used by God. He said, I'm 85 years old. Give me my mountain. And he points to the mountain that was promised to him, where the Anakim lived, where the giants lived. And the last time we see him, he's trudging up a mountain at the age of 85 to go knock off a bunch of giants because he believed God. If God is for me, who can be against me? Be strong. I don't know what you're facing today, but can Moses give you the same challenge? Be strong, be courageous. If God is for you, who can be against you? God is on your side. God goes ahead of you. He goes with you. He fights for you. And I don't know what promised land, what battle you need to fight, but the promise is out there, and that's where God is. And so I'm going to follow him. Have a blessed day. Be strong. Be courageous.